Have you ever been lost in a city without a map? Trying to find your hotel, you're just walking around in circles, hoping to find the right way? Well, if you don't set specific language goals and form habits to get you to those goals, that's what it can feel like, lost without a map. This week, our special guest is Bree from the Into the Story podcast, and Bree has some excellent advice on how you can avoid that frustration and help you to get on the path to achieving your language learning goals. Welcome to Aprender Inglés with Bree and Craig. Hello, and if you're a new listener to the podcast, you're very, very welcome. The aim of this podcast is to help you improve your English and take it up to the next level. My name's Craig, and if you have listened to this podcast before, you'll notice that my regular co-host Reza is not here with me today. However, I'm delighted to have the company of Bree from the Into the Story podcast. Bree and I talk about goal setting and why you should set goals for English self-study. Bree explains what SMART goals are and why you should make your goals SMART. We also speak about habits, creating habits, habit building, and habit stacking. We also talk about the difference between active practice and passive practice with learning a language, and also how to make your English practice fun. We had a lot of fun recording this podcast, and we hope Bree's tips and advice will help you organize your self-study and reach your English goals. And now, please enjoy my conversation with Bree from Into the Story podcast. Bree, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's really nice to speak with you again.
Craig, thank you so much for having me. I had a lot of fun when you came on my podcast, so I'm really happy to be on yours.
That's right. We have spoken together before, but listeners of this podcast will not have heard you, Bree. So let me just mention that I was a guest on Bree's podcast, Into the Story. And I recommend you go and listen to it because I did share a very personal story that I've never spoken about before on this podcast. So it was episode 37, I think, Bree?
That's correct.
So yeah, go and have a listen. You can find Into the Story on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And of course, I'll put a link in the show notes. And you can find the show notes to this episode at inglespodcast.com/476. So Bree, let's start with a question I ask people who come on and the listeners are listening to for the first time. Where is your accent from?
That is a very good question, Craig. Whenever people meet me, even native speakers, they always ask me where in the States I'm from. So where in the US I'm from. But in fact, I am from Canada.
That's a common mistake that many people make. Do you feel insulted when people ask you where you're from in America?
No, of course not. It's something that's totally understandable because, in fact, I sometimes make the same mistake because the accents are very, very similar.
I noticed that when I listen to a Canadian speaker, they pronounce the oo in about in a slightly different way. Words like out, about, shout is slightly different. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. So if you ever hear an American imitating a Canadian, they will say about or a boot.
A boot.
Yeah, which is a very exaggerated Canadian accent. But it's true that we do pronounce that OU a little bit different. But again, very, very similar accents. Unless, of course, you're talking about an accent from Texas in the US, which is very different, or a New York accent. But anyone on the West Coast of Canada or the US has a very similar accent to mine.
Okay, that's interesting. And the first Canadian speaker, I think, with a Canadian accent we've had on this podcast. So it's fantastic to have you on for that reason as well.
Wonderful. I'm honored.
Now, today we're talking about habits and goals. And I know that that's a subject that you like talking about. But before we get into it, I think it's important to say that setting goals and building habits around your English studies, especially if you're studying by yourself and you're not following an organized course in a language school or maybe studying with a private teacher, it's very, very important. And I think particularly relevant at the time of recording this podcast, which is June 2023, because here in Europe, in the Northern Hemisphere, we're at the start of the summer break. And I apologize if you're suffering a cold winter in the Southern Hemisphere at the moment, but many people are thinking of having that break, maybe going on holiday. And it's important, if you want to keep in touch with your English by yourself, to set some goals and develop some habits so that you have consistency and your level doesn't drop. So we're going to have a look at four main areas here. We're going to look at setting goals, building habits, and practice. So some practical tips on how you can take those first steps, and also how you can make it fun and enjoy your English studies. So Bree, let's start off with goal setting goals. Why is it important to set goals, especially if you're studying by yourself?
That's a very good question. And I think, I know that goals are the key. They are the most important thing to getting fluent in any language or achieving anything, really, because a goal gives us a destination. It gives us a reason for putting in all of the effort that it takes. So I have had with my husband and my business partner an English school for over 10 years, and I have seen a lot of different learners. And I think there are two different types. There are the learners who have a very clear goal. For example, a student, we'll call her Sarah. She had the dream of going to Canada to work in the tourism industry. That was her goal. That was the reason why she wanted to study English. And then another student, we'll call him Paul. He did not have a goal. He just wanted to improve his English, but he did not have a goal. And I can say that Sarah was much more focused and she found a lot more enjoyment in studying English. But this is also important for people, or especially important for people who are studying English on their own. Because when we're studying on our own, we need a lot of motivation to be consistent. So I believe, Craig, correct me if I'm wrong, you have talked about SMART goals on this podcast before. Is that right?
Yes, we've mentioned SMART goals, but for people who haven't heard those episodes and have no idea what a SMART goal is, could you explain what SMART means as an acronym and how it can be useful?
Yes, absolutely. Well, first of all, I am not the person who invented SMART goals. They came from a man called Charles Duhigg, who wrote a book called Smarter, Faster, Better. Now, Charles talks about goals in two different categories. The first type is a stretch goal. Now, that's a big goal. Think about it as a North Star. So the place you want to get to. For Sarah, that was going to Canada to study tourism. Now, normally, most people will only have one stretch goal, one big goal. But then the other category of goals are called SMART goals. These are normally smaller goals that will lead us to or take us to the big stretch goal. Now, SMART stands for S, specific, M, measurable, A, attainable, R, realistic, and T for time specific. So if you want, I'll just give you an example of how Sarah's was a SMART goal. So Sarah wanted to go to Canada. Now, that's very difficult to reach without SMART goals. So for Sarah, she set the goal of getting her C1 advanced certificate from Cambridge. Okay, so this is very specific. We understand what it means to get the certificate, and it's also measurable. Sarah can do practice tests and see how close she's getting to her C1 certificate. It's also attainable. Sarah has an upper intermediate level, but she wants to get a little bit further. So Sarah's not trying to become a native speaker. That would not be attainable, but a C1 speaker. Realistic. This is absolutely a realistic goal and time specific. She wants to get her C1 by November 2023. So that's an example of the type of SMART goal.
And I will put a link to that book, Smarter, Faster, Better by Charles Duhigg in the show notes for people who are interested. It is a very, very useful book. I read it years ago and I think I need to reread it because it's very, very useful for goal setting. And Bree, speaking about your why that you mentioned earlier, why are you studying English in the first place? And the example of Sarah, I spoke to a student recently who's interested in improving his conversation, his speaking, his studying for C1, and he needs to strengthen his weaker area. So what are your thoughts on if you are studying English in general, and if we divide English skills into speaking, writing, listening, and reading, I think it's also important to focus on a particular area that may be your weaker side that you need to strengthen and improve. Do you have any comments on that?
Yes. So I would say, I think for a lot of students, a lot of people, speaking is the thing that we want to do most. It's the skill that we most value and work towards. So if speaking is what you want to improve, then I would choose a SMART goal that can help you improve your speaking. You could, for example, choose to go to a meetup event. A meetup.com has a lot of different events in a lot of different cities where you can practice your conversational English. This would be an example of something that's very specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time specific, where you're going to go to a place and have to speak in front of people. And if they can't understand you, then you will feel probably a lot of pressure to improve your speaking. So I think that having a specific place where you can practice that skill, it will be helpful to focus the student towards improving. Does that make sense, Craig?
That makes a lot of sense. And I think we both agree that setting goals for language learning is a very important step. And let's move on now to building habits, because goals are very important, especially if you're studying by yourself, and also building habits. But why are building habits important for self-study, especially if you're going on a summer break, for example, and you don't have the guidance of a private teacher or a language school to guide you through the process of improving your English?
Absolutely. So if the goal is like the star, the thing that we're working towards, then habits are kind of like a ladder or a spaceship that's going to get us towards the star. So habits are the steps and the key to any goal that we want to achieve. So let me give you an example of myself and a goal that I have, an ongoing goal that I have, and how I use habits to get myself there. So I am not a morning person, okay? I enjoy to sleep in the morning. But a long time ago, probably 10 years ago, I set the goal of waking up every morning, if possible, very early, around 5:30, to do yoga.
That's it.
It's crazy. It's crazy early.
I was with you up until then. Up until that 5:30, I was, I'm the same. I'm not a morning person. But 5:30, how on earth did you find the motivation to do that if you're not a morning person?
Well, I'm a mom and I have 2 kids. And if I don't get up at 5:30, then I don't have any time for myself.
Right.
So when I'm thinking about being alone in peace and quiet with birds and just by myself, that is a very, very specific goal for me. That's very motivating for me. So 10 years ago, I set this goal that I want to get up every morning and do yoga and meditation. And the way that I started to do this was, well, going to sleep early, first of all. But second of all, a rule that I call the start with 5 minutes rule. And I know that when I'm laying in my bed at 5:30 in the morning, I will not feel like I am not going to want to wake up. I'm going to want to just continue sleeping. So I'm not expecting to feel motivated to do this at that time. But I tell myself, start with 5 minutes. Get up, get out of bed, take out your mat, and just do a forward fold. Just touch your toes. Okay. And then that forward fold will lead to a downward dog. And then that will lead to a whole series of yoga poses. And before I know it, I've done my practice and then I do my meditation. And after that, I feel amazing.
And you
But
don't feel like going back to bed, probably,
and
because you're awake.
exactly. I feel very energized. I also went to bed at probably 9:30 the night before, but I have this rule that I've set the goal. I expect that I'm not going to feel the motivation to do it when it's time to do the thing that I want to do, but I just start with 5 minutes.
So transferring this to English practice, if someone wants to improve their grammar, they don't really feel like doing it. They know it's maybe pretty boring, but they know they need to study their past tenses of irregular verbs, for example. Just saying, I'll do it for 5 minutes, hopefully will lead to a 15, 20-minute habit every day.
Exactly. So knowing that we tend to think of our future selves as a separate person than us. So I can say, tomorrow morning, I will wake up at 5 in the morning, 5:30 in the morning, that I think of that almost as a separate person. But knowing once I get to that point in time, that it's going to be me. I'm going to have to do that. So expecting that you're not going to maybe have the motivation to do it, but knowing that if you do it, you will feel good afterwards. If I study my past verbs for 5 minutes every day, I will slowly see progress. And a very important or useful thing is called habit stacking. Have you heard of this, Craig? Habit stacking?
I've heard of stacking. That's where you put one thing on top of the other. So I'm guessing you start with one habit and maybe stack or put another habit on top. Is that right?
That's exactly right. So what we recommend doing is making a list of your current routine. So you can just do this, write it on a piece of paper or on your phone and just write down the things that you do every day. You wake up, you have breakfast, you commute, you take the train or your car to work or school. Maybe you do some cleaning. So all of these things would be existing habits. Then you choose one of those habits. For example, let's say your commute in the morning, the time that you're on the train. This habit is going to be called a trigger. How would you explain trigger, Craig?
Well, I don't have a gun, but if I did, if I did have a gun, if I lived in a bad area of Chicago, for example, then my gun would have something that my finger pulls to fire it, to shoot out the bullet. So anything that triggers something else starts a process. A trigger is the thing on the gun that you pull to fire it, but the verb to trigger means to start something or start a process.
Exactly. So this habit, getting on the train, is the trigger. It's the thing that starts the process for doing another thing. Okay, let's imagine you know that every single Monday morning, you are going to have an English podcast episode in your Spotify feed because you know that every single Sunday, that podcast releases. So you wake up, you have breakfast, and you get to the train station, you step on the train, Now, as soon as you step on that train, the routine, the habit has been triggered. You sit down, you put in your earbuds, and you listen to the podcast. That's an example of habit stacking. It's very, very specific. As soon as I step on the train and I sit down, I listen to the podcast. You do not allow yourself to do anything else. Do not open your WhatsApp. Do not open your social media. Do not do anything but that thing. So trigger and then habit.
That's very, very useful and very powerful, because many times we do things, if we're driving, for example, or when we first get up in the morning, we don't even think about the habits that are connected one after the other. I wake up, I go to the bathroom, I wash my face, and immediately I reach for my toothbrush without thinking, because I do it every day. So if you can incorporate that into your English studies without thinking, you will naturally progress from one thing to the next.
Exactly. And something that's important to set ourselves up for, or help ourselves to be more successful with habit stacking, is to prepare our environment. So for me, that means that my yoga mat is ready and that I put my phone away in a drawer that is not between my bed and my yoga mat. So I do not give myself the option of opening my phone and checking all of the WhatsApps that have happened the night before for my friends and family in Canada. I prepare my environment to help myself be successful. Now, for someone who wants to listen to English podcast on a Monday morning on the train, we need to make sure that their phone is charged, that they have their earbuds ready to go, that they're not putting anything in the way that's going to be tempting to do instead of the habit that they want to have.
You sound very, very organized and very deliberate, and it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. One problem I have personally is if I start a habit, let's say daily exercise, for example, or daily Spanish lessons that I sometimes try and do. Sometimes I break the chain. A chain is something that connects, you do regularly, for example.
Yeah.
What do you do if you have these habits in place and something happens? I don't know, maybe you're sick, or you go on holiday, or your kids have an event or something, and suddenly your habits stop. How do you get yourself back into the routine and the habit?
That is a very important question. And I maybe sound like I'm very deliberate, which I am, but I'm not. I'm human, like everyone else. And I also studied psychology, and I'm very interested in the science of habits and the science of motivation. And there was a study that came out, and I'll get it to you. I don't have it right now, but it found that people who are flexible with their habits are more likely to retain that habit for a long time.
Well,
So for
Yeah.
example, somebody who is very strict about going to the gym every morning at 6 o'clock is less likely to retain that habit, to still be doing it in a year or 2 years or 1 week, than the person who says, yes, I like to go to the gym before work, but if one thing happens, if X happens and I can't go, then I go at lunchtime. And if something happens, then I go after work. So, of course, it's good to be consistent, but you must be flexible. You have to be flexible. If you're not flexible, then as soon as you stop doing the thing, you say, oh, I didn't wake up myself. This happened last week. I had an extremely busy week where I had to wake up, take my kids to school, and then go straight into the city for something. And I didn't do my yoga or meditation. And I felt bad, but I knew, okay, this is a 1 week. Next week, I'm going to start it again. And I keep it realistic that I know that from now until I'm 99 years old, I'm not going to do yoga and meditation every single morning at 5:30. But as long as I'm flexible about it and I keep the expectation that I'm not always going to have the chain going one day after another, it makes it very easy to get back into it, to start doing the thing that I want to do again. Does that make sense, Craig?
It does. And there's nothing like yoga to improve your flexibility. Sorry about that.
You couldn't resist.
I couldn't resist. I was thinking, no, Craig, don't say it. Don't say it. It's a bad joke, but I said it anyway. I apologize.
I love it.
One question, Bree. When you're starting a new habit, do you give yourself a reward, a prize for doing it? Like maybe saying, after I study grammar for half an hour, I'm going for a walk, or I'm watching my favorite TV series, or maybe listen to a song you really like. Do you set that reward for after doing something difficult?
Always. I always use rewards. So in the world of motivation and habits, there's something called sticks and carrots. So a stick, a palo, is when if you don't do something, you get hit, okay? Whereas if you do something, you get a carrot. You get something as a reward. So me specifically, I make myself a coffee shake after I do yoga. I cannot have that shake, and this requires discipline, of course, but I cannot have that coffee until I do my yoga. Even if it's 5 minutes, I have to do it. So I think having a reward for yourself is absolutely a very, very good way to give yourself a little bit of dopamine, to give yourself that good feeling after you've done something. So you listen to your podcast. Well, listening to a podcast isn't a good example because it's very enjoyable, but you study your past tense verbs and then you get to listen to a podcast, and then you get to have your coffee or your piece of chocolate or whatever motivates you truly.
Yeah, chocolate is definitely my reward of choice, but very good advice. Let's move on to actually practicing to make progress in English learning. And I'd like to talk about the difference between passive practice and active practice when studying English, because you mentioned podcasts. Many people like to watch TV series. What's the difference between passive and active? And can you give some examples of the different activities and why it's important to have a balance?
Yes, absolutely. Okay, let's start first of all with thinking about when we learn our mother tongue or our native language when we're children. We always have a balance of passive, which is exposure to the language. So, for example, with my son, from the day he was born, he was listening to me speak to him in English. And he was listening to a lot of podcasts, probably as well. And then at a certain point, around his first birthday or second birthday, there will be slowly introduced a need to use that language. I will ask him, do you want water? He will say yes, or water, please. So there will be a need in his environment to use it. Now, when we're learning a language, it's the same. We have passive activities. Now, this is the exposure. So, for example, reading and listening are considered more passive activities. And then we have a need to use the language. These are active activities, like writing and speaking. Now, any language, whether it's a language that we're learning as a foreign language or our mother tongue, we need to have a balance of these two things, of passive and active. But in general, we are going to have more passive before we get to have the active, before we start actually writing and speaking. But for students who are at an intermediate level or above, we recommend that they mix them. And something that's important is that it's not absolute. So a podcast listening isn't necessarily totally passive, especially if we use active listening. For example, if we're reading the transcript as we're listening. So as we're actively listening, we're going to retain the information more. If you're listening to a podcast and you're reading the transcript, you could take, say, 3 words or expressions that are new for you, and you could write them down in your vocabulary notebook or on your phone and write it with a sentence. So what you're doing is you're actively using your brain to produce the language. And this is going to make it much more engaging and more likely to remember.
That's a very good point. Another example that you could do to combine active and passive, if you are watching a film in English or a TV series and there's a section you don't understand, you can switch on the subtitles. You can isolate words and expressions that you didn't quite catch, you didn't get, write them down. So you're not just letting the language flow over you, which is good sometimes. It's not just going in your ears and disappearing, but then you're focusing on and identifying and noticing the language that maybe you want to start using. And I like to think of it as two circles, a small circle and a larger circle, and the small circle's inside the larger circle. And the larger circle is what you understand when you listen and when you read. And the small circle inside is what you actually produce when you speak and when you write. And as Bree said, when you are a baby, then obviously that's going to be like that. And then eventually you'll start speaking. So try to focus on making that smaller circle bigger and being more productive in language. And although it's not always easy, sometimes it's uncomfortable to get outside your comfort zone, making that effort to notice and focus on language and also use it to go out there and speak to people, that's when that smaller circle starts to become bigger.
That's absolutely true. I love this big circle and small circle because it does show that they're not separate things. It's not like there's the passive, the listening and the reading, and then totally separate the speaking and the writing. They're absolutely connected. Something that I've heard you talk about, Craig, and I think that's interesting and I have personally used in learning Spanish is shadowing.
Yes.
So could you tell me how you would use shadowing, for example, as people are listening to your podcast, how you would recommend it?
Yes, if we're teaching a particular expression that you find interesting or the way we say something, or maybe you notice a slightly different pronunciation that we're using that you wouldn't normally say it like that, then just go back and isolate a very short piece of language and listen to it and then repeat it. Now, you can repeat it more or less at the same time as you're hearing it, or you can repeat it immediately after. But the idea is to copy as close as possible the intonation, the stress, the pronunciation of a native speaker. And the goal is to try and produce it as close as possible. And I think that's really useful for rhythm. I think it's useful for pronunciation and also for learning new expressions and words. So it's another tool in your toolbox. Is another thing you can use as you're working on your English.
Absolutely. And to continue on with the past verbs, for example, I know a lot of students have problems or difficulties pronouncing the past regular verbs. Walked, for example, the past of walk. It's good to just continue saying it when you're alone driving in your car. Walked. And you continually are actually exercising your mouth in a different way that eventually you'll be able to say it. I personally use this to say the word dog, perro. I remember driving in my car or hiking in the mountains and saying it over and over and over again. And after a long time, eventually my mouth was able to say the word perro.
I'm pleased I'm not the only one who has a problem with that. I had problems with that for years. It was either not enough, so it sounded like but, pero, or it was too much. It was perro.
Exactly.
Which, I couldn't get it right.
There's a tongue twister in Spanish that's in the translation in English is like house of metalworker. What's it called? Metalsmith?
Not an ironmonger. It's a silversmith or a smith, a metalsmith.
A smith, yeah. So metalsmith's house, wooden spoon. Okay, but in Spanish, I think it's you guys. I hope that your listeners enjoy this. Casa de herrero, cuchillo de palo. To say herrero is the worst. Try it. Herrero.
Casa de herrero. Casa de herrero. Not very good.
It's hard. Anyways, it's practice.
I need to practice that. I need to shadow. So this idea of shadowing is one way, as you've seen, to make it fun, to make the idea of studying fun,
Yes.
especially if you like particular TV series and you've seen them maybe dubbed in your language. Well, why not switch to original version and try this shadowing when your favorite character in the series says particular things that you enjoy?
Exactly.
So what other ways can we use, Bree, to make study fun so that we keep motivated to get this consistency?
Well, I think the most important thing, maybe not the most important, but something that's absolutely important is finding what you like and doing more of it. So if you like listening to podcasts, then listen and listen more. Because this motivation for listening will then start spreading to other skills. You'll start feeling very confident, and maybe your motivation will start spreading to speaking or to writing, for example. So find what you like and do more of it, I think is absolutely important. And another thing is don't worry about doing it wrong. Okay. You cannot learn a language wrong. There's absolutely no way for you to do it wrong, in my opinion. So if you like watching Friends in English with or without subtitles, do that. It's not wrong. If you want to use English subtitles, great. If you're feeling tired one day and you decide to use Spanish subtitles, that's okay. You're still doing something. So follow Nike's advice and just do it. Don't worry about doing it wrong.
That's very good advice. I also would like to add, I think it's important to realize what kind of learner you are. For example, me, I like video. I'm much better when I'm learning a language or Spanish, for example. I'm much better listening to it and using audio and video rather than books and writing a journal in Spanish, for example. Now, it's important to remember that reading in a language is also useful, especially if you're studying for an exam. We spoke about this earlier. You need to work on all 4 skills, but also notice how you learn effectively and focus on that more.
Absolutely. But I think what you're saying is absolutely right. And especially during the summer months, making it fun is important. And just to finish up this thing of making it fun is a continuation of the habit stacking that we talked about earlier. So if you find something you like, if you're going to listen to a podcast on the train, try to be consistent and try to track your progress. So even if that means writing a little tick, putting a little mark on your calendar that you did your listening or you did your practice B2 first exam that day. Okay. And lastly, variety. So listening to different things or trying different skills. So there's nothing like a little bit of variety to make things fun and interesting. So those would be my tips to make it fun.
Absolutely. I think this episode has been packed with excellent advice and tips for people who are studying by themselves and find it difficult to get that consistency. So, Bree, thank you so much for your time and for coming on the podcast. And again, if you want to listen to Bree's podcast on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts, it's Into the Story. Into the Story. Search for that. And of course, links, as I said at the beginning, will be in the show notes at inglespodcast.com/476. Bree, thank you so much. And I hope we'll speak again soon.
Fantastic. Thanks, Craig. It's been a lot of fun.
Many thanks to Bree for sharing such useful and practical advice on setting and achieving your goals and habit building. Now, Bree's podcast, Into the Story, is a wonderful podcast. I highly recommend it, and I suggest you listen to it and subscribe today. Bree puts a lot of love and care into creating the podcast, and it definitely shows. Into the Story podcast. And now it's your turn to practice your English. Do you have a study plan for your English? We would love to hear it. Send us a voice message and tell us your English goals and which habits you have now or intend to create and put in place in order to reach those goals. You can send your voice message to speakpipe.com. That's speakpipe.com/Ingles podcast. If you prefer email, you can reach me at Craig, CRAIG, at inglespodcast.com. This podcast is sponsored in part by mansioningles.com. If you're looking for a paid course to help you with your English, go to store.mansioningles.net. And before I go out the door today, I'd like to thank all of you who are helping us by supporting this podcast on Patreon. And you too can join our Patreon program for a minimum of $1.50 per month. And with that, you also get instant access to our transcription so that you can read every word that you hear. Go to patreon.com/Ingles podcast. There isn't time, unfortunately, to mention everybody who is on our Patreon program, but I just want to say hi and thank you to our latest Patreon supporters, and they are Ángel Albaladejo Pérez, Thanawat Sakthanakul. I'm sorry, Paul, I did try to pronounce your name. I do apologize if I've mispronounced it, Paul. And Carlos Esquerdo, and also Luisa Del Valle Arias, who has increased her support of the show. Thank you very much, Luisa, and to everybody who is supporting us on Patreon. Next week, Reza will be back on the podcast, and we'll be talking about British and American English grammar differences. So if you sometimes get confused with British English and American English from a grammar perspective, next week's podcast will be very useful for you. Thank you so much for listening this week. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to tell your friends so that more people can listen. And until next time, it's goodbye. The music in this podcast is by Pitts. The track is called See You Later.